UN 영어뉴스 아르세니 아브라모프 The Forgotten Soviet Genius of Modern Music 100 years ago today, the extraordinary symphony of silence revolutionized the way we compose, perform, and experience music. So why was it visionary composer forgotten for decades? Asks Alex Sakalis. 100 years ago, a 36-year-old Russian composer named Arseny Avraamov climbed on to a specially built tower in Baku, Azerbaijan, then part of the USSR, surveying the urban landscape before him. He lifted two red flags and began to wave them from side to side. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary musical events of the 20th century, one which, until recently, remained almost completely forgotten. The event was the Symphony of Silence, a musical work incorporating the city of Baku as its orchestra. It was staged on 7 November 1922 to celebrate the 5-year anniversary of the October Revolution, and included the entire Caspian flotilla, cannons, locomotives, artillery regiments, hydroplanes, factory sirens, bells, foghorns, brass bands, and a massive choir. Avraamov wasn't just conducting an orchestra, he was conducting a city. The flag wave signaled the first cannon shot, which cued the silence of the industrial plants. The fifth cannon shot cued the silence of the docks. The 15th cued the silence of the flotilla, while a military brass band began playing and marching towards the harbor. Soon, locomotive horns appeared, along with machine gun fire, followed by the melodies of the magistral, an instrument invented by Avraamov for this performance, consisting of 50 steam whistles attached to pipes, which could be operated independently, like the keys of a piano. Avraamov waved his flag that was the cue for the hydroplanes to take off, as a choir of thousands shouted, "Hooray!" Another cannon shot cued silence, except for the haunting melodies of the magistral. Suddenly, a faint chorus of voices could be heard singing. More voices joined in, and the unmistakable hymn of the International rang out. As the choir grew, the silence began again. and the Hydro Prince swooped back down over the harbor. The brass band was back, playing a rather familiar tune, La Marseillaise. Cannons fired into the sea, and machine guns unloaded into the sky. Church bells, until then silent, began chiming as the noise reached its climax. Then silence, more renditions of the International. Before the silence, the maestro, the brass band, and the choir all returned for one final aesthetic chord that washed over the city. In many ways, it was the culmination of Avramov's extraordinary, peripatetic career, a visionary who sought to merge politics and music until neither could be distinguished from the other. He was an inventor, a modernist, a futurist, a revolutionary, a composer, and an eccentric. He shone brightly, but was ultimately buried by the same political system that helped to nurture him, largely forgotten after his death in 1944. His innovations nonetheless foreshadowed some of the most important musical trends of the second half of the 20th century. Long before Pierre Schaeffer recorded the locomotives at Batignolles station, long before John Cage redefined the parameters of music, long before Karl-Heinz Stockhausen decided to stick a string quartet on helicopters, long before all that, there was Avramov, born in Novocherkassk, Russia in 1884. Avramov's early life revolved around writing music and getting arrested for communist agitation. His two interests coalesced somewhat after the Russian Revolution, when he was appointed Culture Minister for the People's Commissariat for Education. One of his first acts was to ask Vladimir Lenin if he could burn all the pianos in the country, considering them symbols of the old political and musical order. Lenin's answer is not recorded, though the continued existence of pianos in Soviet Russia suggests that his proposal was not taken up. Avramov devoted much of his time to developing his own microtonal theory, which he believed would emancipate people from the shackles of the 12-tone, octave-based Western musical tradition. Later in his career, he developed techniques for sampling and synthesizing sound, making him one of the pioneers of sound editing. After working on the soundtrack for the first Soviet sound film. Avramov's plan Veliki Labot. He began experimenting with creating sounds through drone with musicologist Andrei Smirnov, crediting him as the inventor of graphical sound. All this makes Avramov one of the progenitors of the broad umbrella genre that we now call electronic music, but it was Symphony of Silence that remained his most revolutionary work. A new world required a new music, theorized Avramov, not just new tonal systems and instruments, but an entirely new concept of music. What it was, who it was for, where it was performed, how it was experienced. There was an idea after the Russian Revolution that we should do something on the street, that we have to escape from the boring bourgeois concert hall and do music for people working in the factories. Music not for the rich, but for everybody. Sergei Kismatov, an award-winning composer and musicologist, tells with culture, transformative experience. Avramov aimed to create a musical work for the proletariat, using the sounds of the machines and the factories that were now under worker control, rather than spectators. He sought the active participation of everybody in the performance, offering a transformative experience that symbolized unity, agency, and the revolutionary power to decide one's own history. In his vision, factory silence that regulated the start and end of the working day were transformed from symbols of oppression into sounds of emancipation. Symphony of Silence was, in many ways, the sound of a new world being born. Avramov argued that Western music, in its theory, composition, and performance, reinforced the cultural hegemony of the ruling class, and so alienated workers from realizing the potential for music as an organized and emancipatory art form. It was important for the purposes of the ruling class, he argued, to separate workers from the means of creating and experiencing music. Music has, among all the arts, the highest power of social organization. He wrote, "We had to arrive at the October Revolution to achieve the concept of the Symphony of Silence. The capitalist system gives rise to anarchic tendencies. Its fear of seeing workers marching in unity prevents its music being developed in freedom. Beyond the sheer spectacle no one had ever tried to incorporate the entire urban landscape into a musical performance before, let alone hydroplanes and battleships. Avraamov broke several musical boundaries and foreshadowed the direction music would take in the second half of the 20th century. Avraamov prefigures Stockhausen's sonic environmental art, imaginatively extending the notion of space in which a piece of music can take place. David Stopp's author of Mars by 1980, the story of electronic music, tells BBC Culture. He also anticipated Skyfall's music concrete, where the walls between art and everyday life are collapsed and the sound mirror of the actual existing world becomes a source for music. We can say that with the Symphony of Silence, Avraamov pioneered the idea of using non-traditional instruments for both composition and performance, adds Kismatov. In later works, Avraamov would go on to incorporate tools such as saws, grinding wheels, axes, and sledgehammers into his music. Instead of a traditional score, he used written instructions and musical notation so simplified that anyone could understand it. Symphony of Silence exemplifies a mode of music making in which virtuosity, notation, or traditional methods of musical arrangement are dispensed with in favor of a more conceptual approach, says Stubbs. It's about how you sequence and juxtapose elements. That's as true for the most recent EP by British electronic musician Barrier as it is for Avraamov. Symphony of Silence was attempted just once more, a year later in Moscow, though at a much reduced scale. Undeterred, Avraamov began plotting his next project, installing powerful electroacoustic devices on Zeppelins and flying them above Moscow. Not content with conducting a city, Avraamov now had the skies in his sights. There were two problems though. Firstly, Avraamov was broke. Secondly, the revolutionary atmosphere in Russia that had fostered a radical, artistic avant-garde was coming to an end. Symphony of Silence represents what a lot of early electronic music represents: a utopianism, a lost future, says Stubbs. It was commissioned at a time when it was still optimistically held that the grand, revolutionary, egalitarian prospect of the Soviet Union could operate hand in hand with the artistic avant-garde. Sadly, that was quashed in time under Stalin. The Zeppelin project never left the drawing board, and Avraamov died in poverty and obscurity. Interest in his work only re-emerged in the 1990s, and the first reconstruction of Symphony of Silence based on Avramov's notes and using samples took place in 2008. The following year, Kismatov debuted his own reconstruction under his preferred translation, Symphony of Industrial Horns, at a fort in St. Petersburg. It later appeared in Documenta 14 and has gone on to influence a new generation of electronic, avant-garde, and politically motivated composers. In 2017, Avraamov made an appearance in the BBC documentary Tunes for Tyrants with presenter Suzy Crane, heralding the Russian as one of the forgotten geniuses of music, and even performing her own tribute to Symphony of Silence as she stood on a Moscow rooftop and waved two red flags from side to side. Long after his death, Avraamov is finally getting his due. We now know that he was a genius, but at the time, people thought he was crazy. They couldn't see what he was seeing, says Kismatov. The tragedy of Avraamov was that he was simply too far ahead of his time. He broke barriers too soon, and the musical ecosystem he created couldn't survive outside of its incubator. Many of his ideas, now commonplace, were ridiculed, and his work was ultimately muffled out by an increasingly conservative and reactionary Soviet regime. It's said that the 30,000 people who bought the Velvet Underground's first album all started a band. The 30,000 people who experienced the Symphony of Silence were simply too shocked to know what to do with themselves.